Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to my new YouTube channel, Patrick Goes Wild. You are tuned in to another episode of Wild and Live. Now, for those of you that are coming back to this show, thanks for joining us again. For anybody that's new to this series, what's Wild and Live all about? Well, it's a new series of online conversations and live lessons that looks into the biology of some of the coolest, the freshest, the dopest animals on the planet. And we're doing that by enlisting the help of some awesome wildlife experts. Now, before I introduce you to today's expert, I'd like to remind all of you to subscribe to the channel. Make sure you have a look through the scheduled videos and then you can set a reminder for the ones that take your fancy. Also, remember, use the hashtag WildAndLIVE. And also, if you've got any questions, please ask the questions down there. There's a little box right down there to get your questions in. I'm having a look right now who's asking any questions. Hi, Patrick and Ruth. Mateo and Kaylin watching from Gibraltar. Awesome. Yay. I love that. That's amazing. Now, I think it's about time that I introduce our guest. Actually, this is our first guest because on Monday I was all by myself. So our first guest is a polar explorer, expedition leader, and wildlife filmmaker. She's also a really good friend of mine. Her name is Ruth Peacey. Ruth, how are you doing? Let's just make sure we can get you up. There you are.
Hello. Can you hear me?
How are you?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes,
Yay.
I can.
Excellent.
I'm going to turn you down on those monitors so everybody can hear you properly. People saying, hi, Ruth. You're coming to us all the way from the West Country, but you're normally like thousands of miles away in Antarctica.
Absolutely, yeah. So only 2 weeks ago, I was down south in Antarctica. I got one of the last flights back here to the UK, and I've gone from being completely isolated with a small bunch of fantastic people and a whole lot of penguins to being isolated here at home. So it's kind of one extreme to the other, really.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think everybody's going, trying their best to fight the cabin fever that we're all kind of that we're feeling at the moment. It's interesting that you've been to Antarctica 5 times. 5 times. By the way, I'm making a pact with you right now that the next time you go, you're taking me.
Sure.
I like that. Sure, maybe. Right. So let's get into it, because for most people, they like to, for their holidays and to relax, they like to travel, to probably go on a beach holiday in the sunshine with a drink in hand, but not you. So you seem to have a really strong bond with Antarctica. What is it that keeps you going back for more?
Well, obviously, it's the penguins. Without a shadow of a doubt, that was what took me there in the first place. That's what made me want to go there. And that's what's driven me to keep returning, because these little animals are just incredible. They're absolutely fascinating. And this is an opportunity to see animals, birds even, get up close, see their behaviours, and really understand an animal that's not really being interrupted in its normal behaviour by human activity. And that for me is really, really special. That's what drove me there in the first place. However, going back, it's got to be this emotion that just takes over you. It's incredible. I can't describe Antarctica in words. You have to experience it. You have to feel it. You can look at the footage, you can get a grasp for the colours, and you can see the landscape. But when you're there, it's overwhelming. It's all consuming. And the penguins are actually just a very small part of that. And when you're there and you see the vastness of the mountains and you see the ice scapes and the snowscapes, you really understand how much of a small part of that they are. But of course, for me, they're the most important part. They're the reason that I ultimately do keep going back. And they're the thing that, even when I'm here in the UK, I love more than anything, for sure. Maybe don't tell my dog that.
I can literally sense that passion and excitement coming from you. But let's think about how you get there. I imagine it's not as simple as just hopping onto a flight from Heathrow, putting on your eye mask, falling asleep for 20 hours, and then landing in Antarctica. How do you get there? And also, how long does it take?
Boom. Well, okay, for me, as someone who's gone on expeditions down there and who kind of prefers that way of traveling, you get on a small yacht. So you do get on a plane if you're traveling from the UK, and you get down to South America. You get down to the very tip of South America, a place called Ushuaia. And I can post some pictures to show you where that is on the map a bit later, because I haven't done that, I've realised. And then you get on a boat. And in my case, the first time I ever went, I got on a 54-foot yacht. So imagine how big your front room is now for most people, maybe your front room and your kitchen. And that's probably the size of the yacht that I travelled down to Antarctica on. And I was on that yacht. Initially, I got on the yacht and I was on there for, well, it took 5 days to sail the Drake Passage, which is the body of water that lies between South America and Antarctica. And then once you get there, you can't just jump off the boat because there's ice and there's all sorts of challenges. And you find yourself stuck on the boat for probably, I think we were stuck on the boat for 9 or 10 days without being able to get off at all.
Wow. Really? So even after you got to Antarctica, you were stuck on the boat for another week at least?
Yeah, it was, well, yeah. So we were fortunate or unfortunate. So the first time I ever went south, I went down ahead of any other boat that season. So our team went down right in October, and there were no other scientific vessels, there were no other tourist vessels, there were no other ships or anybody heading south at that point. So we were the first boat down, and the reason that we were going down there so early was to get all of the penguins returning from their winter feeding and get them when they first make that big long journey to their grounds where they're going to breed. And we were really lucky because we got there just in time and we were able to do that. But getting down there so early means there's still a lot of sea ice around, and we hit big storms on our way down. So we had a huge amount of ice on the boat. They calculated by the amount that we had to chip off of all the rigging and everything once the weather cleared, because of course you can't do that while the storm's still hitting. There was 6 tons of ice on the boat, and they calculated that by the amount it rose out of the water afterwards. And when we arrived, the bay that we were going to go into should have just been open water, and we should have been able to sail in quite close, chuck a boat over the side, a small rib, and just motor in, get all our stuff ashore and film. But of course, things never go smoothly in filmmaking. You know this as much.
Of course they don't.
Same with any expedition. And what happened was we got there and this whole bay was completely full of ice. So we couldn't get off the boat immediately. It would have been far too dangerous to do so until we were sure that ice had settled. Once we were sure it had, we took poles and we took as little gear on our backs as possible because we wanted to remain as light as possible. And we gingerly made our way across the ice. So, yeah.
I like that. Gingerly made your way across the ice with all your filming kit, hoping that you don't fall through the ice. But let's take one step back quickly, because I want to talk about the Drake Passage.
Sure.
So you've flown all the way to Ushuaia, which is right down at the end of South America, and then you're only 600 miles away from your target.
Yeah.
What I've heard that journey, that trip across the Drake Passage, isn't for the faint of heart.
No, so there's two, and
when I say the faint of heart, I'm actually talking about myself because I get really, really seasick.
Okay, yeah. So I don't get seasick, so I'm quite lucky. And I'll tell you why I believe I don't get seasick. The truthful reason. I think I don't get seasick because I'm so excited about penguins. And I'm so excited about what I'm going to see and what's around me. And I'm keeping my mind occupied because I'm reading as much as I can. And I know if you get travel sick, you can't always read, but you can get up on deck. You can look out of the window, even when the storm's blowing an absolute hoolie. And we had 67 knot winds. So we couldn't get outside during that time. It would have been far too dangerous. But I would be looking out for birds just out of a tiny window that was really only maybe 3 times the size of the screen in front of me right now, in front of your computer screen. You have this tiny window that you're looking through, and that just kept me going because I was watching out for penguins. I didn't know when I was going to see my first ever penguin. I didn't know what other birds I was going to see. There's albatross, there's prions, which are these tiny, small, silvery birds. There's Wilson's storm petrels. Now, these are phenomenal little birds that just dance across the water. They almost look like swifts, but across that with a butterfly, because their wings are like this, and they touch the water. They're known as the Jesus birds because they walk on the water. There are all sorts of things you can always be looking out for, and I genuinely think I was so excited that seasickness just didn't even occur to me. I didn't give my brain time to get sick.
So you're saying that if I ever make it down to Antarctica, I'm going to be okay from the sheer excitement. I'm going to hold you to that, Ruth. But let's talk about that first time you went to Antarctica. So you've been there 5 times.
Yeah.
The first time, it had something to do with penguins going to the post office. Now, that sounds really, really bizarre, but it's the truth. So tell us about that. What's going on with these penguins at the post office?
So there's a base on the Antarctic Peninsula called Port Lockroy, and it's run by the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, so woohoo to them. And they maintain an old British base as it was 50 plus years ago, because it was a running scientific base in the 1950s. And that's subsequently closed down, and they've gone back and they've reopened it as a museum because it's perfectly well preserved. And it's also run as a gift shop and post office. So people who are there can go in, they can have a look at this base and see things like jars of Marmite and tins of Bovril and bunk beds and all the things that were there back 50 years ago, exactly as they were. But then they can also go into the post office and send a postcard home. And the great thing is that this base is now, it wasn't when it was built, but it's now surrounded by 3,000 breeding gentoos. And gentoos are a type of penguin. So it's great.
So this post office is kind of like a museum, like stepping back in time 50 years.
Yep.
You can also post a letter all the way from Antarctica.
Yeah.
And then you've got the benefit of hanging out with these penguins. You were filming Gentoo penguins specifically.
Yes.
Now, that sounds like the most idyllic, probably one of the best jobs in the world. But let's stop and take a think about this for a minute, because you're filming a colony of 3,000 penguins, Gentoo penguins, that like to go out and feed on really oily fish. And we know that what goes in must come out. So tell us, Ruth, about the joys of penguin poo.
Penguin poo, or guano, is my favourite thing. It's my second favourite subject after penguins themselves. It's amazing. I'd love to make a perfume. I think it would be good for a one-off Christmas special. I'd probably only get away with it once because I'm pretty certain no one would buy a second bottle. But I would call it eau de krill. And the reason I'd call it eau de krill is because it's this lovely kind of pinky colour, and the smell is very unique. And it comes from the fact that these penguins are eating, the majority of their diet is krill. And so they get a lot of krill. Like you say, what goes in comes out, and they have this big red kind of, it looks like mud everywhere. But you have to remember, when you're in Antarctica, there is no mud. So any mud that you're seeing is penguin poo or guano. And it's a whole ecosystem in itself. They've got a whole trajectory where they poo outside of their nests so that they don't defecate in their own area. So they're quite clean. Yeah. Unfortunately, that means majority of the time they're pooing onto their neighbours, which is quite comedy, I have to say, comedic. But the best thing is that there's a bird called a sheathbill that lives around these penguin colonies, and that's Antarctica's answer to a pigeon. It's a small little white bird. It's the only bird in Antarctica, in the continent itself, that doesn't have webbed feet, that breeds down there. And it's very much like a white pigeon, but it's called a sheathbill because it's got no feathers around here. So like a vulture, it's got a kind of bare patch of skin around its beak. And that is primarily because it feeds on guano. So it goes around feeding.
Well, hang on a second. So you've got one bird, which is squirting out all this delightful oily mess, as you like to call it. Eau
de krill.
What did you call it? Eau de krill.
Eau de krill, yeah.
And then you've got another bird that's eating that poo.
Yeah. Yes.
Sounds disgusting.
Yeah. So it's
horrible.
I have to look this up so that I pronounce it right. But it goes what's known as coprophagy, which means that it eats poo. So there we go.
Yeah. I'm not going to be taking any advice or inspiration from the gentoos. I prefer my food unprocessed by other organisms.
Interesting.
Now let's see.
Fishing
Before we continue, I want to check
go
in on our stream. Let's see if we've got any questions coming in for Ruth. Let's have a look. No questions there, but I do have a question on Instagram. Let's go for the first question here.
Okay.
This is coming from Lawe, asking, what kind of training did you have to do to sensitize your body to prolonged sub-zero conditions?
Oh, exciting. I like that question. Well, if you really want to go down that route, you could take a whole lot of cold baths and showers and start practicing getting really cold. But the best thing, of course, is to not let your body get cold in the first place. So it's not so much about training your body to cope with the cold, but preparing your mind and all of your equipment so that you don't ever let yourself get that cold. So it's about being able to recognize when you're starting to feel a bit cold and maybe putting an extra layer on. It's about learning to take layers off before you get too hot, because if you sweat, you die. So the key thing is, if you're doing a lot of work, if you're carrying a lot of things, is to be a little bit cold when you start off and you'll warm up. And then when you stop and you're filming for a really long period of time, then you put all the layers on that you can think of, because you don't want to get cold, and have lots of hot drinks. And I have to confess, the first time I ever went south, the bottom of my sleeping bag, this much of my sleeping bag, turned to a block of ice. And that was true story in the yacht. Yes, it was very, very, very cold. But
sounds very cold, sounds very unpleasant. So there we go. That's how you prepare for those conditions. It's all about getting those layers right. You don't want to start sweating, you don't want to get too hot or too cold. You want to be just right, like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Now, I've got a couple other questions for you before we head off. We're 15 minutes in. I think we can push until like 25 minutes, so let's keep going. Now let's go back to the Gentoos, because we tend to have this really innocent view of penguins, but I understand that the colony that you're filming, it's kind of full of drama. Adultery and robbery were everyday occurrences at the colony.
Everybody thinks of penguins as these sweet, innocent, lovable creatures, and they're just really funny because they fall over a lot. And to an extent, all of that's true. But it's also true that they are slightly evil. And
why is that? What's the adultery and what's the robbery all about?
So basically, as with every animal in the world, their desire to breed and reproduce and continue their species line is what's driving them to thrive, to live, and do everything that they do. Breeding is the most important thing. That's the case for every animal. They feed in order to be able to survive, in order to be able to pass on their genes to the next generation. And that's absolutely true with penguins as well. And so what they're doing is they're protecting their nest. If you've got a big nest, so they Gentoos and all the brushtail species. So brushtail species, we're talking Adelie penguins, chinstraps, and Gentoos. And I can tell you about the difference between them in a moment, just in case you're looking out your window and wondering what you're looking for. We've got Gentoos. Gentoos, as I say, these are the ones we're filming, and all of them build their nests out of pebbles in the Antarctic. So they create, it almost looks like a little volcano.
Like a little mound of pebbles.
A mound of pebbles with a small dent in the middle. And if you've got a bigger pile of pebbles, you're going to have, the chances are you're going to be better protected, or your offspring, so your eggs and your tiny chicks, are going to be better protected from rain, which unfortunately does occur in the Antarctic, from snow that falls and then melts, and also high winds and all sorts of things. So what you want to do is have the biggest nest. So what they'll do is they'll collect pebbles at the start of the season, and then you find them not wanting to go all the way down to the beach to collect more pebbles, so they'll steal one from their neighbours. And so and this happens throughout the whole season. And there have been scientific experiments done where they've put coloured pebbles, they've basically spray painted all the pebbles on different nests. And at the end of the season, there's been a whole jumble of different colours, like they've all mixed together. So the blue nest, the pebbles have all spread out with the yellow nest, and so on and so forth, all over the colony. So this is happening all the time. And it's not just the Adelies that were made famous in Frozen Planet. It happens with all the brushtail species. And it's super, super, super
Oh, really?
exciting.
Okay.
And they get really feisty.
So they're all stealing pebbles from each other, trying to build the bigger nest.
Exactly. And then if one of them catches another one stealing, they will properly fight it out. They'll peck each other. They'll slap each other with their flippers. And it's just, honestly, it adds to the comedy. It really does. I shouldn't say that, but it does. It really does.
So it's comedy, drama, daylight robbery, adultery. Sounds like a...
It's a drama.
Yeah, it sounds like a soap show. Sounds like an episode of EastEnders.
Exactly.
Now let's have a think about some of the actual chicks themselves.
Okay.
So once all of this drama is, like you said, is essentially to try and pass on their genes to the next generation, and that comes about through a nice little egg that they lay, and then a chick hatches. Now, for the first 2 weeks, that chick is totally dependent on its parents.
Yeah.
Do you notice a difference between the experienced parents and those that are first time mum and dad? Do you get like super mums and super dads of the penguin world?
You do. You definitely get super parents, ones that are really good. But I wouldn't necessarily be able to look at 5 of them and say that one's less experienced. Over the course of the season, it becomes more obvious. The chances are, if they've bred successfully before, and they've worked together as a team, as a pair before, because they're not necessarily remaining in the same pair bonds throughout their whole lives. Sorry, Morgan Freeman, but that is the case. If they have worked together as a team before and they've been successful, then the chances are that success will continue, because they will know how to protect their nests better. They'll have got the better nest site in the first place. The more experienced ones will probably come back a bit earlier, find the better nest sites and be able to breed there. They'll be able to protect, like say, find better food resources, work better as a team, and basically protect their young so much better. And also the really inexperienced ones, the ones that aren't necessarily quite mature, tend to come back towards the end of the season. And right at the end of the season, what you see is them going through the process of mating, courtship, and all of these things. And that's right at the end of the season, when it's far too late. And any offspring that they do manage to produce will, of course, unfortunately die, because they're just way behind in terms of the time frame, because they have to do this while the food's available and before it gets too cold. Because once it gets too cold, chicks will not survive, unfortunately. When they're born, they're the size of a hamster. They could fit, not that I've ever done this, but they could fit in the palm of my hand.
Oh, so
they're
cute.
So tiny, but they're so vulnerable. And they've got this tiny, really fluffy, downy, furry feathers. They're not waterproof at all. And so if the parents aren't really on it and really looking after them, then they're open not only to the weather that can come, as I say before, you get rain, you get snow, which can cause hypothermia. And unfortunately, if the nests aren't high enough, they could even drown in that. But also they're susceptible to predation, even from those sheathbills. The poo-loving sheathbills will also eat when they're really tiny, eat tiny little chicks as well.
So it's a bit of a tricky life as a young penguin, as a young gentoo. I've got a couple other questions that I want to fire your way. Let's see, what time are we on? We're on 22. We're going to go for a couple more minutes. Okay, quick fire questions, Ruth.
Okay.
Why don't penguins' feet freeze?
Oh, well.
Quick response.
Okay, it's to do with their blood circulation.
Because they have blood coming down and blood coming up that warms their feet.
Yeah, and they can shut off the blood. So when it's really cold, they shut off the blood, as much blood going down to their feet as they do coming up. That's a really short answer.
Awesome. Okay, next question. Where do they feed in the winter? You said they were coming back, ?
At sea.
Feed at sea, and they're feeding
mostly on krill, also fish, and some squid.
Nice one. This is a great one from Laura. How fast are penguins underwater?
Aha. So gentoos are the fastest penguin in the world. They've been recorded swimming more than 25 miles an hour.
Is that your question? Did you put that question in there?
Me? No, I can't see the question.
You came up with that so quick. I like that. That's a great one from Laura. I'm going to have a look on my Instagram. We do have a few more questions here. But actually, let's think about that. I want to roll on Laura's question there about how fast penguins swim underwater. I know that penguins have this incredible ability to collect micro bubbles on their feathers, which then helps them swim faster and also helps them launch out of the water. Probably the only time that you're going to see a penguin fly in the air.
Yeah, when they come out of the water, yes. So
Yeah.
that's porpoising, and they'll do that because they still need to breathe. So they'll come to the air to breathe, and also they'll use that opportunity to look around for predators as well. So things like leopard seals and orcas that might be trying to eat them in the water.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got a question for you, which is, now I did some research here, and I know you're going to call me out on this. There are supposedly 21 species of penguin out there. Am I correct?
No.
And why am I not correct?
Well, okay, so
I did a lot of research for this, Ruth.
I know, and do you know what? You could have spoken to all of the leading experts out there. You could have spoken to every single penguinologist in the world. Real job title. How cool is that? You could have spoken to anybody, and everybody would have probably given you a different answer. And the reason is that the number of species of penguin in the world is still being debated now. So I went to the Penguin Conference back in August, which is where all the scientists involved in penguinology get together and talk about all the new science that's coming out. And they're still debating whether how they're going to split some of the species further, and how they're going to maybe merge some of the species that are currently split together. So
but that sounds kind of confusing to me, Ruth, and anyone else that's listening is probably like, if these super clever scientists who call themselves penguinologists, surely they should know how many different species of animal they're studying. Surely they go out and they look at a penguin and they go, that's an Adelie, that's a gene-2, that's a chin strap. What's the big fuss?
Definitely, and I agree with you, but sadly it's not as simple as that, and it's really not that straightforward at all. So basically, the way that they're dividing the species now is done genetically, and they're looking at different populations that have been segregated on different islands, really remotely, in different parts of the world for a really long period of time, and they're going through their genetic profiles to work out how distinct they are from one another. And that's really how we're discovering new species of penguin at the moment. Sadly, I would be hugely surprised if we could ever go out and go along and go, ooh, there's a new species of penguin, and discover it just like that now. As much as I'd love to be an explorer that did that.
Yeah, I suppose you've got so many penguins that look alike. And it does come down to small differences in their features or sometimes their behavior. But like you said, it's all about looking at their DNA and seeing how closely related each of these species or subspecies that will become their own species.
Exactly.
How closely they're related. Yes. I want to finish up on one big question for you. Two of my probably my favorite. Okay, I've got three favorite penguins. One is the jackass penguin, which I think is I think that's an unfair name to give them. They're also known as the African penguins. They live, as their name suggests, at the tip of the southern end of the African continent. Yeah. And then king penguins and emperor penguins. Now, I, for the life of me, cannot tell the difference between a king penguin and an adult king penguin and an adult emperor penguin. The only way that I can tell the difference is by looking at their chicks, because I know that king penguins' chicks are brown and super fluffy, and then emperor penguin chicks, well, look like aren't brown. They kind of look like greyish versions of their adults, of their mum and dad. So how can you tell those two apart?
Firstly, you're never going to see the two, or if you ever see the two together, please write to me and tell me, because as far as I'm aware, you will absolutely never encounter an emperor penguin and a king penguin in the same place in the wild. Emperor penguins are found entirely on the Antarctic continent itself. They breed on the ice shelves around there. King penguins are found, they're actually a subantarctic species, so they're found on the subantarctic islands, and they're not found on the Antarctic continent proper, as kind of science calls it. So that's the first thing. So the chances of you having to identify the two in the wild are very remote. However, totally appreciate you might be given a picture and you're like, oh no. So if you're given any kind of size guidance with that picture scale, that's really going to help you. Emperor penguins are massive. They're really, really big. Think like size of a sort of 3 or 4 year old child, whereas or a huge backpack that you or I might carry when we're doing our filmmaking. Whereas king penguins are kind of maybe 3 foot. They're maybe a bit bigger, but they're not really that much. They're probably about this high. Whereas emperor penguins are probably up here. You can't see that, it's higher. The key thing.
So it comes down to size with the adults. But I like that little bit of knowledge, that knowledge nugget that they occupy different species. Yeah. So you've got the emperor penguins, which are a true Antarctic species, and then the king penguins are sub-Antarctic. So they live on islands like South Georgia, for example.
Exactly, on South Georgia, where there are literally millions of them. So yeah.
Great. Ruth, we are almost out of time. Let's have a look. Where are we up to? We're up to half an hour, so I'm going to whiz through a last couple of questions. Let's have a look on here. Why are penguins mainly black and white? From Fred Owen, who's 9.
Amazing. Okay, so that's actually called counter shading, and so they've got white underneath and dark tops, and that's so that when they're in the water, their prey or also their predators can't really see them underneath, because if you're looking up into the water, you're seeing sunlight coming down, so they're light underneath to match the sunlight or the lighter top. And when you're swimming along, if you look down, it tends to look quite dark looking down into the sea, so they've got dark tops, so anything going over them won't see them from underneath.
So counter shading, and it's a strategy to help them avoid predators. Okay, let's go on to the next question. Let's have a look. Can I come next time, says Ian Stainer. How does the equipment cope in the harsh conditions? Have you found your fingers freezing when you're trying to focus on a penguin?
I always wear gloves, even really thin skin gloves to kind of protect my fingers. And I have to say, you probably can't really see it now because the last week or so I've been working really hard, but the ends of my fingers have started to peel over the years. So that's kind of my subject to cold weather. So I have to protect my hands. I keep them moisturized, and also I use a lot of hand sanitizer. Oh gosh, bad word to say. But when I'm out in the field, I'm trying to keep my hands clean. I'm constantly washing my hands, so they do dry out quite a lot. So and with the cold as well, the key is to use a lot of moisturizer and keep your hands covered. And the kit, I use those little, you get hand warmers. So I put them in my pocket.
Nice hand warmers. Keep your hands warm. Exactly. Keep your hands moisturized and sanitized. Hand warmers on
batteries, and put batteries inside, like inside your top and stuff, to keep them warm.
There you go. Top tips from Ruth Peacey, wildlife filmmaker. We've got 2 more questions before we before we head out. From Camilla, are they, as in penguins, are they as cute in person as they are on film and on pictures?
Yes, they are. They're absolutely as cute. They are absolutely adorable. They're wonderful animals, and they are absolutely super cute. Yes.
Okay, final question coming in from Sky Hodson. Can you see the effects of global warming both on the ice and with the penguins? Surely that is that's a big deal for the penguins. Climate change affecting their habitat.
Hugely so. And just pulling up the stats here, just so I've got them right to hand. So there's been an 85% reduction in Adelie penguin populations along the Western Antarctic Peninsula since 1974. So that's 85% of these animals have declined since 1974. That's due to sea ice melting, because the Adelie penguins, much more so than chinstraps or gentoos, that have got a bit more plasticity in their diet, so they're more diverse in what they can eat. Adelies really do depend on sea ice to forage for food, particularly during winter. So as that's melting, they're becoming further away from where their traditional colonies would be, so they've got further to travel. Also, there's more snow falling now. With less ice, you've got more I can't think of the word, evaporation.
More water that's exposed, I suppose, right?
The snow's deeper and it's staying for longer, and now that snow is melting at the kind of the peak time that the snow's melting is coinciding with the peak breeding time of the Adelie penguins, and that's unfortunately flooding nests and increasing chick and egg mortality, which is really sad. And gentoos and chinstraps are much more intolerant of ice as opposed to Adelies that depend on it, so their populations are actually increasing. So you've got winners and you've got losers.
Yeah. So really challenging times for some of these penguins, in particular,
Yes.
the gentoos that rely on that sea ice and to forage for those that krill underneath the sea ice. But Ruth, I think we are gonna call it a day there. I'm gonna check if we've got any other questions. No, we don't. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure, and maybe we'll talk to you again in a couple of weeks' time, depending on how long we're all in this situation. But a big thank you on behalf of everybody that's watching for sharing your wildlife expeditions and your love of penguins with us.
Bye.
Good stuff. I'll talk to you later.
Awesome. Cheers, dude. Bye.
Thanks, Ruth. Awesome. So that was Ruth Peacey, wildlife filmmaker. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. Our next episode is on Friday at 11 a.m. We're going to be talking to Desmond Gowes from the Running Wild Cheetah Conservation. Shall I start that again? We're going to be talking to Desmond from Running Wild Cheetah Conservation on Friday at 11 a.m. Fingers crossed the internet holds up and we will be bringing you a cheetah live from South Africa. Until then, thank you for watching. My name's Patrick IE, and you've been tuned in to Wild and Live. I will see you next time.